Hello, guys. Good morning, everybody. I am so happy and so delighted to say hello again to all of you. And now we are starting a new unit, which is Unit 4, and the name of the unit is Your Mind. So, in this new unit, guys, as you have been checking, we're going to be exploring some aspects about our brain and language and also our mind. And as this lesson apparently is a little bit more scientific or more into the area of psychology, we're also going to explore some vocabulary related to that area and some grammar that can help us express ideas in English in a more formal or academic way. So, you have been doing the test in Unit 1, and that type of test is designed with a purpose. The purpose of the test is designed to, well, check how good your mind is. So let's analyze some sentences about the test. So it says, read the sentences below and discuss the questions with the person next to you. Let's do it individually. And if you have questions when we connect, we can discuss them, right? I have two sentences there, sorry. Sentence number 1 says, psychologists devise those types of tests, talking about the test in the book. Number 2, those types of tests are devised by psychologists. Now, I have 3 questions that I want you to analyze and reflect with me. Question A, in what way are both sentences similar? In what way are they different? And what structure we are using in each of them? Let's analyze that. So, in which way are they similar? It's kind of simple, right? Both sentences express the same idea, or they are saying the same thing, right? Sentence 1 and sentence 2, they are saying exactly the same thing. But now, in which way are they different? That it's kind of obvious to our eyes that the order of the different parts, the different words is different. Because psychologists in number 1 is at the beginning, but in number 2 is at the end, and vice versa. Those types of tests in number 1 it's at the end, but in number 2 is at the beginning. So the order is different, the structure is different. So if we're saying that the structure is different, then what is the structure that we are using in number 1? And what is the structure that we are using in number 2? Do you know? Probably you know. Let's take a look at number 1. Number 1 starts with a subject, then we have a verb, and then we have a complement or an object. And that example is one of the most common examples of sentences that we use in English, right? A subject, a verb, and a complement is the structure of a normal sentence in English. We call those types of sentences active voice sentences, because the most important thing is the subject, so we start with the subject. Now, in number 2, we have a type of subject, but if we check the subject in number 2, we can see that it's actually the object for number 1. So we are starting with an object, and then we have verb to be, right? And then we have a type of past, which is actually the participle form of a verb. And then we finish with a complement, which is the object, but in this case is the subject of sentence number 1. So we can see that the structure is inverted. You know the name of that structure, right? Sentence number 2 is a passive voice sentence. So we can see that they are different in structure. In this unit, we're going to be studying how and when we use passive voice sentences. And first, we need to identify and understand what is the difference between active and passive voice. So we know just by looking at the structure that they are different in structure form. That is very clear. So in passive voice, let's just remember that when we create a passive, we start with the object and then we use verb to be and then we use the participle form of the verb, and we can option in as an option include the subject at the end of the sentence. In passive voice, the subject that goes at the end is called the agent. So it is possible. We know the structure. I'm not going to explain the structure too much. But what is the main difference? The first difference that we can make between active and passive is that in active, of course, the subject is the most important thing in the sentence. That is the reason why we start with the most important thing, which is the subject. And in passive voice, what is more important is the object. So that is the reason why we start our sentence with the object. Every time you start a sentence, the first word you put at the beginning is the thing that you consider most important in your sentence. That is the first difference between active and passive voice. What is important? In active, who, and in passive, what is receiving the action. Now, there are other aspects that we need to consider when we are using passive voice. Passive voice tends to be, of course, more formal than active voice. And when we talk about formality, we say that we use passive voice most of the time when we are writing scientific, technical, academic writing, probably in a journal or in a type of scientific magazine, in an essay, for example, in newspapers. It is very common that we find passive voice sentences. That is another difference. Passive voice tends to be more formal. And the third thing that we need to consider is that passive voice most of the time is used in written form rather than in spoken form. When we speak, it's more common that we use active voice. When we write and the writing is formal, we prefer passive voice. Now, it is possible to use passive voice in spoken form, especially when we are giving, for example, a conference or we're giving a speech in a context that is formal. Think about the president giving speeches and using passive voice, or you giving a lecture, giving a small talk or conference at school, making a presentation. It's more common that you use passive voice sentences on those circumstances. So we need to consider those three things. What is important in my sentence? Formality, right? The context, and also spoken or written form when we decide to use passive voice. Now, I think that the most important one is the first one. What is important for me in the sentence? And basically, that is up to you to decide. So sometimes there is no correct answer between using active voice or passive voice, because it is you who is going to decide what is important to emphasize in the sentence, and it is you who is going to decide the context, formality or informality. So be careful when you are deciding active or passive voice. However, there are some cases in which only one option is possible, or active or passive. Let's take a look at that. I have here some sentences for you to reflect on. The instruction says, which one is the best way to answer or continue the sentence? And I have a question there. Imagine the context. Do I have to tip? Probably to people talking in a restaurant, probably to friends, to colleagues, family, I don't know. And you have two possibilities to continue the sentence or answer the question. Number one or number two. Which one do you think is the best way? Think about it. Do I have to tip? Number one or number 2? What is important for us to mention in our conversation? The people at the restaurant that in the question is not mentioned, or the action of the tip, which is service? The service, right? So in this case, number 1, which is active voice, is not the best way to continue. We prefer number 2, which is passive voice, right? And you can say, okay, but this is not a formal context and we're not writing, we're speaking, right? But that's the reason why the first rule, what is important in my sentence, is one of the most important aspects to consider when we use passive voice. So do I have to tip? No. Service is included. That is the best way to continue. Because what is more important to emphasize is service, not the people. In the second example, I saw a gust last night. And I have 2 ways to continue. Number 1 or number 2. Number 1, again, is active voice. And number 2 is passive voice. Which one do you think is the best way to continue the sentence? You don't know? Are you confused? Or you got it? I think the best way to continue that one is to continue with the idea that we have in the original sentence, or continue with something that the person is going to understand or have reference. What is the only reference that we have in the original? The ghost, right? So we should continue the sentence with the ghost because the person is going to understand immediately that we are continuing the sentence talking about the ghost. So the first one, number 1, I think it's the best way to continue the sentence. I mean, with the active voice. So I say the ghost was wearing a white dress. Starting my sentence with a white dress in passive voice, number 2, is not the best way because I'm talking about something that has not been mentioned in the sentence before. So it can be confusing and it's not important. The white dress is not important. The important part of the story is the ghost, not what the ghost was wearing, right? So what the ghost was wearing is just extra information to describe the person, or in this case, the ghost. So think about it. Sometimes there is only one possible way to continue, active or passive. So think really carefully what is important in your sentence. First, the subject, the object, and then you can think about formality and also about spoken or written form when you are using passive voice. Now, there is one more thing that we need to consider when we talk about passive voice. Remember that for passive voice, the agent or the subject of the sentence sometimes is not important. And we can omit the subject or agent when we create a passive voice structure. And we include it in the sentence only if it is giving important information. I have 3 examples here. The 3 examples are in active voice. And I want you to think for a second which one would be the passive voice equivalent. I mean, try to convert those sentences into passive voice. Careful with the tense. The first one is present, the second one is past, and the third one is present again. So when you convert into passive voice, you need to use verb to be appropriately in present or past or in any other tense. Remember that we can use passive voice in all tenses. We can use it in present, in past, past continuous, present perfect continuous, future, etc. We can use this structure in all tenses, so be careful. You can pause the video if you need to in order to create your sentences, and then you can continue to check your answers. I'm going to give you some seconds to do that if you want to practice this. Remember, try to convert those sentences into passive voice. Ready? Did you do it? Let's take a look at that. Number 1 says, they invent many devices every year. When we convert, the first thing that we need to do is identify the object, because we're going to start our passive sentence with the object. So in this case, the object most of the time is the phrase or word that is after the verb. So in number 1, the verb is invent. So what is after invent is my object. So many devices. So I start with that. I start with many devices. Then I put the verb to be. I need verb to be. And verb to be needs to coincide with my object. My object is plural and is present, so I use are. Many devices are, then I put my verb in participle form, invented. Many devices are invented every year. What about they? Do I need to include they in my sentence? Is it giving me important information? Let's check. Now I have the converted form. And I can see that I'm not including they in the passive sentence because who are they? It's very ambiguous. It's not giving me exact information or important information or clarifying information. So I can eliminate they. It's a big mistake to include in passive voice sentences the particle by them, because most of the time by them is not giving us information. Careful with that. Number 2, people donated clothes and goods to the homeless, active voice. When we convert that into passive voice, we have this. Clothes and goods were, past, donated to the homeless. Who did that? People. Do we need to include that? No, it's kind of obvious that people are the only ones who can do that. I don't think animals can donate things, right? So again, people, it's very general. It's not clarifying or giving me important information. So I don't need to put by people. I can eliminate that part. And finally, number 3, China exports thousands of electronic products every day. When I convert, it's thousands of products are exported by China every day. Now I'm including the subject because it is not the United States, it is not Mexico, it is not Russia. I need to clarify who. So in this case, it is important to include the subject in the sentence, which now is the agent. And if you have problems, or if you put every year or every day in a different position, it's okay. But most of the time, we tend to include the adverbial clause at the end. So I prefer to put it at the end so the passive voice is clear and it's completed, and then the rest of the sentence is just clarifying time. But you can also put thousands of products are exported every day by China. That's another possibility. Think about it, guys. I know you know this information, especially the one about the structure, but we're going to be practicing that in the book. So I suggest you read the grammar box on page 37. And there we are also going to check how we can also use the passive voice to create other structures, right? And substitute, for example, relative clauses. And I suggest you read the grammar box on page 37, and we're going to keep working there and doing some more activities to practice. Again, if you feel that you need more practice or you need to read more examples and check more structures regarding passive voice, you can check the grammar reference in your book on page 140 and study 1. And read the information there, and you have extra activities that can be helpful for you to understand. If you have questions or there are parts you don't understand from this presentation, make some notes. When we connect, you can ask and we can discuss. Thank you very much, and let's keep working.